Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's really fantastic to see so many people joining us today for our World Water Week at Home Wash Systems, Sustainability and Resilience, Why Do They Matter? Learning and Networking event. My name is Fraser Goff. I am WaterAid Australia's technical lead for system strengthening, and I'm hosting today's webinar from Dili in Timor-Leste. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement, which I have workshopped with my Timorese colleagues. I pay my respects to the Timorese people, on whose land and among whose culture I am honoured to live and work. And I pay my respects to the heroes of the Timorese national liberation struggle, past and present. We encourage all participants on today's call to consider the ongoing legacy of colonialism in the places we are joining from, the strength of First Peoples, and the role each of us has to play to ensure a better and more equitable future. Some housekeeping before we start. Please keep your microphones muted and videos off until we join the breakout discussions. But feel free to open the chat box and introduce yourself and where you're from. Today's event is one of 3 sessions happening around the world as part of World Water Week, coordinated by Agenda for Change. Agenda for Change is a collaboration of like-minded organizations that have adopted a common set of principles and approaches. Members work collectively to advocate for and support national and local government in strengthening the wash systems required to deliver universal, sustained access to wash, as outlined in Sustainable Development Goal 6. Today's event for the Asia Pacific is co-convened by WaterAid, WaterSHED, and the Australian aid-funded Water for Women Fund. A big thank you to the teams who have put together today's event, especially to Alison, Sovattha, Alison, Phoebe, Matt, David, and all of our moderators. After a brief introduction from me, we will hear keynote presentations from WaterSHED and Water for Women, and then we will have breakout discussions in which you can network and share with colleagues from across the region for about 35 minutes. We'll then come back together in plenary to hear key points from each group. The full session today will go for about 90 minutes. So we have all signed up to today's event because we are interested in wash and health systems and exploring ways to build greater sustainability and resilience. This often means identifying and confronting various challenges such as climate change, emergencies, economic crises, and political instabilities, sometimes all at once. One thing we are learning is that collective action is critical. While many of us on the call today are working already to transform wash and health systems, in the interest of setting a common starting point, let's briefly unpack what we mean when we talk about systems by considering this general definition of a system on the screen and thinking how it might relate to a wash or health system. In each of the districts and countries where we work, we are part of a network of institutions and people united by a common purpose: inclusive, lasting wash and health services. This means that the parts of the wash and the health system are ultimately made up of people like you and me. Within our context, actors like you and I are guided by factors such as culture, policies, political structures, resources, and environmental constraints. Through building collective action and aligning the incentives, norms, and formal or informal power of diverse institutions, we can contribute to improvements in wash and health services. Many organizations and networks, including Agenda for Change and Sanitation and Water for All, refer to the component parts of a well-functioning wash system as the building blocks of a wash system. Such components might include wash planning, monitoring, financing, and institutional arrangements. Building block frameworks have evolved for over a decade, pushed forward especially by initiatives led by the World Bank, UN Water, the WHO, and UNICEF. Talking in terms of system building blocks provides us a structure for discussing the different actors, roles, resources, and institutions at work in the sector system, and the related challenges or bottlenecks. Different organisations frame sector building blocks differently, and I encourage us all not to get distracted by whose building block framework is better than another, but consider that the different frameworks are like the different brands of a laptop which we might use to send an email. It doesn't matter what laptop we use as long as the email gets to its destination. So what does it mean to talk about sustainability and resilience of WASH systems? Sustainability and resilience are sometimes thought of as interchangeable words, but if we dig deeper, we see they're related but not the same. Sustainability, as used in development terms, is often considered as building or doing something that can last over the long term, such as a water point or a hand washing station which continues to function for 10 years or longer. Sustainability can also refer to when a service is fully owned and operated by local actors, such that external agencies are no longer needed to support it. Meanwhile, resilience, as defined by USAID, is the ability of people, households, communities, countries, and systems to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shocks and stresses in a way which reduces chronic vulnerabilities and facilitates inclusive growth. We see then that resilience relies on sustainable systems, but it has an added aspect of crisis to it. The bottom line is that neither WASH sustainability nor resilience can be guaranteed unless we are working with and strengthening the building blocks of the broader WASH system and the people and institutions which comprise it. With that, I'm going to hand over to Sovattha and Geoff from WaterSHED, who will share with us their first keynote speech.
Thanks, Fraser. Happy to be here. Hi, I'm Sovattha, Executive Director of WaterSHED. WaterSHED is a local NGO in Cambodia. Moment, we are sharing our screen. So, yeah, let's move on. So our mission is to build an inclusive market for rural water, sanitation and hygiene, and perhaps unique in the sector. We are actively implementing a strategic exit of our organization, and we will talk about what we mean by this as we get into the case study. So over the last 10 years, we have implemented a sanitation market building strategy that might look different from others, but we take a very disciplined system strengthening approach. And I want to turn it over to Geoff to give a historical perspective on the thinking when we first started and the key point of evolution.
Thanks, Sovattha. Yeah, this is Geoff here. Move to the next slide. We use a philosophy that I want to introduce that's guided a lot of our decisions called the hands-off approach. And the idea, like Sovattha just mentioned about a disciplined approach, it really means that trying to stay focused on not creating new dependencies with our activities, which focus on rural sanitation in Cambodia. This is kind of like another side of the resilience or sustainability coin that Fraser just mentioned, that we believe inherently that if we're always strengthening local actors, the logical conclusion of our program will be our planned obsolescence and indeed the exit of WaterSHED as an organization. But a little bit about our approach and how this developed. You know, in rural sanitation in Cambodia, we started off really focused on the ground level, thinking about firms that produce toilets and install toilets as well as consumers. Fraser just mentioned how you can think of systems strengthening a bit differently, like brands of a laptop. And we've thought of it centered around this point, this firm and consumer level. So when we started, we were focused on the need to generate demand for toilets, which was a new concept, at that time, paying for toilets, introducing compelling marketing. But it quickly became apparent that we also needed to address the business fundamentals for small and medium enterprises. And what eventually this shaped up to become was the pilot of our rural sanitation market building program. Between 2009 and 2011, we developed a product system, created a delivery model, and initiated consumer marketing with these businesses. Now, the idea of thinking of the building blocks in layers shows a little bit how the program, some of them seem a little bit disconnected from the center. But in fact, we learned, for example, that local leadership was a really critical feature for both the sustainability and effectiveness of the program. And we introduced a concept of a leadership development program, Civic Champions, which has actually become critical for our future exit.
Yeah, and it's already phase 3. In WaterSHED and its WaterSHED finals phase, we are focused on the 2 key things. One, that the national government take ownership of the Civic Champion program. This means that they fund, plan, and delegate it to the subnational government. 2, we are pushing the subnational government to lead and collectively coordinate actors working on rural wars, be it government, private sector, INGO, or the hundreds of local NGO there. But it's important for us to say strengthening collective action at the provincial and the national level has been exponentially more difficult.
There's a slide here, I'll mostly just skip over this because the results of this activity have become more or less the well-known part of the story, and there are lots of documents online. There's a study by FSG and USAID documenting this in more depth, and I can certainly put the links in the chat if it's of interest. But, because we're keeping to time, one thing I would like to mention more that we don't often talk about enough, which is a tricky bit, measuring systems change and how system strengthening activities can be evaluated. What that's meant for us, as you can probably imagine looking at those concentric rings, is that as our program evolves and as our definition or our evaluation of performance and success changes from layer to layer and becomes broader, we have to change our metrics over time. And for example, so when we're looking at the firm level and consumers, marketing campaigns and toilet production, the metrics we're using to evaluate our efforts, we're focused around performance, toilet production, and so forth. Now, for example, or more recently, we were doing much more to assess the performance on a leadership basis of our government partners. And importantly, it's a bit meta, but there's been a real shift to put the monitoring systems and the management of those systems into the hands of our government counterparts, indeed so that the monitoring becomes part of the system itself rather than done by WaterSHED or another outside organization.
Yes, and all of this lead to our strategic exit in 2021. When we say strategic exit, we mean closing down the organization, not just closing one program and then moving on to another program. And this does not mean that we are leaving because the job is done. It means that the correct actors are taking the job forward. Thank you, and we welcome question later on. More detail, please contact us through Geoff. Next slide, please. There's our contact on the slide, on the last slide. Thank you. Over back to the moderator, please.
Thank you, Sovattha and Geoff. Our next speaker is Antoinette Kome from SNV, which is one of the partners of the Water for Women Fund. So, Antoinette, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm a bit slow. It's very early here. I will share my screen, Fraser. So I'm going to talk to you about the Water for Women's learning event that was done in Nepal, end of last year, which was called System Strengthening for Inclusive Wash, Leaving No One Behind. So really trying to find the key elements of inclusion in system strengthening. And it's 5 minutes, so I really only have some tiny elements from that event, which was really very rich with a lot of different stakeholders and perspectives. You've already heard from Fraser about a systems approach and that it's about having the whole picture, not just a part, considering broader context, interaction between levels, understanding different stakeholders and their capacities and motivations. I wanted to zoom in on systems boundaries because the choice of systems boundaries are subjective and have an influence on how you see things. If you take cholera, for example, you could be looking at this microbiological level, or you could be looking at cholera inside the human body and consider that as your system. Or you're looking at it at a community level and how it works out in a community, or maybe in a whole area, or a country like Uganda, or the world. And all these different boundaries that you're putting will define, the choice of your boundary will define how you look at the problem. So it's very important to be aware of the boundaries of the system that you put in place and also what is outside of those boundaries. Now, Fraser already shared there's many different ways to do systems visualization. And usually this is done with functional building blocks, which is helpful for us because it helps you to think through the different functions, make sure you don't forget any functions. But when you're talking about inclusion, you don't actually see the people or the processes. And it's important to be aware of those, because maybe you are part of the system that you're trying to change with all your relations, like in the previous conversation where Geoff and Sovattha really were very conscious about the fact that they are part of the system and that they should not create dependencies. And of course, in any system, there are formal structures, rights, entitlements, there's access to resources, formal positions, but there's also informal relations and structures that influence. And you don't see that with your functional blocks. While the processes of exclusion may be in those formal or informal structures. So that's very much what we talked about in the learning event in Nepal. And that it's good to have a systems perspective, but for real change, we need to be aware that this is a simplification and navigate through and understand that there are issues and people and that there's a political economy going on. Another aspect that I think is important to keep in mind is the historic perspective. And I always find it very funny to go back to the first international drinking water and sanitation decade, which was from 81 to 90. Some of you were still in school then. And it says some things which we are still saying today. For example, that it's likely that the goals may be achieved somewhat later than 1990. But also that there's issues of lack of professional staff, operation and maintenance, cost recovery, lack of planning, lack of government policy. And we need to think through why is it that those issues were relevant at that time and they're still an issue today. So what is the historic perspective on that? Of course, this event was done in Nepal, so I thought it was good to mention Nepal in that presentation. So in the event, how did different participants present their system and the system they are working in? Some presented it more as an intervention process with blocks, or like Geoff and Sovattha did in circles, right? Others started from the government structure and showing the government structure. I probably need to speed up. I only have one more slide. And how in the government structure, civil society, private sector is located and where are the intervention points. But others in the event came much more from a person's perspective, also looking at exclusion processes at a very personal level, sexual minorities or ethnic minorities. And others use those building blocks that we already spoke about. So my only message here, or the main takeaway, well, there was a lot of richness in the event, but one of the takeaways from this event is that the systems visualization and system thinking is very useful, but we need to be aware, be conscious that it's a simplification of reality and emphasizes certain aspects. For often it emphasizes the functional aspects. So we need to be flexible in our minds and see also in those functional, in that functional picture, see that we are only using certain boundaries, see that there are people around in there, and see that there's a political economy there. And then think about, okay, what visualizations helps my understanding and that of my stakeholders, and how do I see entry points for change? Thank you very much. Fraser, back to you.
Thank you very much, Antoinette. In a moment, you'll be invited to join our breakout rooms. But first, a few tips for those of you who are new to Zoom breakout rooms. When the rooms are activated, you will receive a message to join a breakout room. Please click the blue Join Breakout Room button and you'll automatically go to your room. I apologize, there are a few people that are still to be assigned. We have had a glitch with some of our IT, but so please be patient if you're not automatically redirected. Once you are in your room, if you require any assistance from hosts or co-hosts, you can click on the Ask for Help button from the meeting controls. Then if you select Invite Host, you will alert one of the co-hosts that you need assistance. You can leave the breakout room at any time to return to the main meeting session, but there won't be much happening in the main room. And you can also leave the meeting via the Leave Now button. At the end of the breakout session, you will receive a notice that the rooms are closing. You can click Leave Now to return to the main room immediately, or at the end of the countdown, you will automatically be brought back. A friendly reminder to please be mindful and mute yourself when you're not speaking. And a reminder that if one person is dominating the conversation too much, we have given moderators permission to mute people. So please ensure that everyone has a chance to share their experience. We have 14 breakout rooms today on 7 topics. A big thank you to all of our volunteer moderators who are facilitating these rooms using suggested questions. Please make their job easy by talking and sharing generously with each other. Moderators might also like to record their room if they like. After 35 minutes, we will all come back together and I will invite each of the moderators to just share a few key points from the discussion in their breakout room. So with that, I will open the rooms and you should be directed to those. Welcome back, everyone. It sounds like you are having some great discussions in those groups. I hope you found it useful, if not, even if it was a short discussion. Just a reminder, if everyone could please mute and just turn off video in the interest of bandwidth. So now we're going to hear some brief reflections from each of our room moderators on some of the key points that were discussed. So we're looking to hear just 1 to 2 minutes on takeaway messages, any points of tension or disagreement, suggested research or current or upcoming resources, or anything else similar to that you'd like to add. So maybe we can start off with one of the sanitation groups. Sovattha, would you like to share your group's reflections?
Sure. Thank you. I'm going to make it very quick. We have few key points we share. Number one, is the stronger system is where local community participate fully. Second, our members suggested that all the design, including the program design or technology design, have to be appropriately designed for preference and culture. Number three, everywhere around the world, and the team suggested we have to practice do things collectively and share the results. Number four, the last point is the government must be involved, both funding and policy, meaning that service provider or from our sanitation team. Number one, probably.
Thank you, Sovattha. Gabrielle, would you like to share from another sanitation group some reflections?
Sure, yes, thank you, Fraser. So within our sanitation group, we talked around, we had examples from rural sanitation, from urban context, talking about FSM as well. And one of the first points we discussed was around the complexity of trying to visualize these systems, of drawing those boundaries around it. And we had examples of just the importance of how people have found tools have helped them to try and understand and to communicate within this complexity. So visualizing, systems mapping, use of sanitation and safety planning was shared, and also to have a sense of that cross-sectoral work. We also talked a bit around the challenges that we face within our sanitation systems. At the national level, we had the examples from Pakistan around the issues they face around the limited sector financing, around the capacities, and also the sustainability. We then talked about the, when we talk about building blocks, how the private sector is often absent. So it's not just the people, but also the private sector. And we talked about in rural sanitation and in emptying services, that's very much the informal sector. And they can be quite resilient, but how they interact with the government, more formal structures, can be quite tenuous at times as well. And then we had an example in terms of about IDE in Cambodia around the formal versus the informal, and also the role of regulation and incentives, and how that interaction between more formal systems and the private sector is evolving, but also needs more attention points to it. So yes, thank you from the other sanitation group.
Thank you, Gabrielle. And then the third sanitation group, while we're on the topic, Sanjay, would you like to share?
Yeah, hi everyone. A couple of points. A lot of us in our group were doing things systems related, but we never approached it from the systems point of view. Sustainability, resilience, holistic solutions was the angle that we all approached it. A couple of people, including myself, also felt that systems language in general is intimidating. It seems to have a lot of boxes that need to be ticked off. And if we approach it from a sustainable point of view, both in how the project works as well as post-exit, that may be a better way of dealing with it. Also, it was pointed out that funding for these kind of projects can, depending on the scale, be either local-led or would require funding from some other source, whether corporate or government. That's it from my end. Resilience is more important as well.
Fantastic. Some very diverse reflections from the three sanitation groups. Should we switch across to monitoring systems change? And David, your group, would you like to share?
Thanks, Fraser. I'll try and summarize the feedback, but if anyone in the group feels I've missed something, please do stick your hand up and ensure that your point is not missed. So I think the conversation picked up on some of the points you gave in the introduction, Fraser, that really the way organizations are approaching how we identify systems change is quite different, and different both in terms of the way that the building blocks model is conceived and applied, as well as the scale or the boundaries around which systems thinking is mapped. So whether that's government at national or district level, whether that's from the CSO perspective or from the community level, the level at which different organizations and institutions are approaching systems thinking can differ. And that links to one of the other points that we were discussing a bit, which is around the limitations of monitoring systems change using the building block framework. We touched on the fact that as part of the SWA model, whilst those building blocks have been defined, there's not much guidance or support beneath them to help understand what is changing in relation to the status of the different building blocks or between the different building blocks, and that only monitoring the blocks misses out on the points that Antoinette was making in her plenary, that there's also the political economy and the relationships between other stakeholders that is an important aspect of the context to understand and to reflect on in terms of what is changing. And the final point, which really fed through a lot of the conversation, kept coming back to capacity and understanding how and where capacity is being strengthened in different ways and by different means, and how that strengthened capacity is leading to strengthened systems change. But as I say, if others in the group have other thoughts and feedback to provide, it would be great to hear them. Thanks.
Hi, David. I don't have anything to add to that. I've just typed something up I was going to send to you via text, and they were exactly those same 3 points.
Excellent. Thank you, Monitoring Systems Change Group. Should we hear from some of the gender equity and social inclusion groups? Perhaps Meghna, your group first?
Hi Fraser. So we had a very small group, and it was really nice discussion revolving around, I think, 4 basic main themes, which was participation, empowerment, sustainability, and overcoming the biases. So I think everybody agreed on the topic that it is important to have women in the position of decision making, and giving a seat to marginalized or sections of the society is important to make their voices heard. And an important tool that was an important point that was raised was, how do we monitor that including or allowing participation of such sections of the group can actually lead to their voices being heard. So different kind of tools like, participation ladder, or even just a very simple tool of counting how many times people actually speak in such meetings, or monitoring changes through FGDs can actually tell us a lot about who are actually having the voices in the meeting and whose voices are being heard. It was also stressed that education and economic empowerment of women are important, so that they have the confidence to break the stereotypes and raise their voices. With regard to, I think, bias, everybody agreed that we have certain biases when it comes to doing, any kind of system analysis or watch systems, to be precise. But I think it is a matter of change, and it is a matter of time that we as gender advocates have to have this shifting attitudes within ourselves, and just give ourselves that time to understand and acknowledge the biases that we have. Apart from that, with regard to sustainability, it was kind of given that women, when they are given different roles in decision making, it is the whole system is kind of sustainable, as many people have found that it kind of leads to having meeting regularly, good funding, and people are kind of disciplined in a sense. So yeah, that was the four main key takeaways from our group.
Fantastic. Thank you, Meghna. Jos from the other Gender Equity and Social Inclusion Group.
Thanks, Fraser. Hi. Yeah, likewise, we had a very small group and a few technical difficulties starting off, but got into some good discussion. It was mainly looking at wash systems or examples at a community level, and like the other group, there were a lot of examples, or more examples, looking at the importance of women as decision makers. In some ways, we really kind of started from the sustainability question around, the examples of women, when women are involved more, the wash system at the community level will be more functional, and some examples given around water management committees and participation on that level. While we didn't discuss tools as such, some of the takeaways were around the real importance of working closely with local leadership and government, and in that way ensuring that GESI, or gender and social inclusion, is brought into local planning processes, which in turn really strengthen access for marginalised groups and for women. There was an example given particularly around people with disabilities and access to services at the community level. And also important was the partnering and the partnership with local organisations in joint planning processes. There was some discussion too around the challenges of challenging norms, and the talk around bias and community bias, and how sometimes for women to be having that same level or ability to be decision makers at community level. There were some good examples around how to increase their their confidence in participating in group processes. Yeah, so I'd say those were the main kinds of things that came out in local leadership, working with local leadership, partnering with local organisations, and challenging norms in incremental ways. Yeah, those are probably the 3 takeaways.
Thank you, Joss. And if you can share some of those examples in a couple of notes when you share back, we can make sure that they can be included and shared more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Shall we jump across to the climate topics? Akaninyani, would you like to share from your group?
Hi, everyone. From my group, that's the climate change group 2, we're looking at WASH in relation to climate change. And we realized that WASH activities were being carried out by so many countries. But the countries we cited example of a country, they were concentrating on water supply aspect of WASH, which was not holistic. It was just a fragment of the WASH system. So many countries are focusing on the supply, and they let go the sanitation and the hygiene aspect of it. So for us to be able to tackle climate change, we have to be able to implement WASH holistically. And we also, in my group, we're also able to identify one of the factors that's hindering WASH implementation, that the different stakeholders are not really coming together to chart a path on implementing WASH. They are acting individually, which will not really be effective, because a collective effort brings more result. And we also talked about limited funding in implementing WASH in different countries. And we were saying that it is better that the available fund with them instead of wasting, because we realized that many countries, from our discussion anyway, we realized that many countries are not really using fund that was maybe budgeted for WASH to do the WASH activities. The fund might have been diverted to some other things. So we are now saying there should be proper utilization of the fund so that we can get we can fully implement the WASH system, and also check climate change together when we implement the WASH system. And I think that's really what we discussed in my group. If there's any other thing, my group members that are on board, and any of them can say what I've missed out. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks for joining at such an early time in Nigeria. Jeremy, would you like to share from the other climate group briefly?
Yes, thank you. Our group covered a lot of territory, so I'll do my best to summarize it. So we discussed a little bit about how climate change is relevant both in the near term and in the long term, and some actions that we can take now in terms of, for example, management of water sources provide near-term benefits, but they also help to build resilience for climate change. And we also need to be thinking long-term about how climate change is going to affect WASH decades from now, which requires a little bit of a longer time frame, or a lens for a longer time frame. And one of the ways that you might take a longer time frame lens is to think about how climate change relates to each of the building blocks of a WASH system, or a sustainable WASH system framework, because we think climate change is probably relevant for any one of the system building blocks. We talked about the importance of institutionalizing climate change for WASH, and a big part of that is involving the WASH sector in discussions with other sectors that are addressing climate change. So every development sector in every country is tackling climate change. Some of them have made much more progress than WASH have, and some of them have already set up even commissions sort of at a national level. And the WASH sector isn't always engaged with those. Sometimes they're excluded from those. And we feel like it's really important that the WASH sector is able to be in that conversation to not only draw on existing expertise that's been developed in other sectors, but to offer our knowledge and support two-way learning. So climate change is really a cross-cutting issue. It cuts across sectors. It cuts across national and local levels. So we need mechanisms for communicating information from local to national levels and vice versa. And it also cuts across time in the sense that we need to think about the relevance of climate change now, but also be preparing for climate change impacts that are many years from now.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. In the interest of time, can I ask our moderators to just share the key points and then maybe send some notes with some more detail later. So Yasser, can we hear from the emergency response group, please?
Yeah, for sure. Hello, everyone, and thanks for the people who, for our team who participated in this group. Actually, we discussed many points, but most of the key things which like we came with it, like we have to focus on the community engagement, capacity building. We have to make sure that the ownership is applied, concrete policies, also ensure the quality of the construction, support the community. Also, we have to focus on the like building relationships, sharing information, avoid any overlapping, like also joint planning, increase the number of meetings. Also, we have to conduct a deeply assessment to the market and the area, and like conduct good studies and assess needs in the correct way. Also working together to avoid any overlapping, and to focus on the emergency and development together. Thanks a lot. That's it from my group.
Thank you, Yasser. Nutan from the Water Security and Scarcity Group.
Thanks. This is Nutan here. I think our group spoke about the water security issue, and we focused on 3 important questions. In the interest of time, I will just speak about what those questions are, and Fraser, I'm happy to put notes across and share it with you. I think our group looked at us as city managers, and we focused on what are the 3 things that we can do to reduce the water scarcity at a city level. What are the things that we can do to build financial stability at the city government level? How can IT enablement support performance improvement for water stewards, water security? And the last important thing that the group discussed was also on what are the 3 innovations that we feel should get replicated across the world to solve water security challenges. I'm happy to share those notes after the session gets over. Thank you so much.
Look forward to those notes and your responses to those great questions. Ranjit, did your group have any points you wanted to add to that on water security?
You mean Lugad? You
can also go Lugad. Your group is, yeah.
Thank you. Just a quick one. We started by unpacking what water scarcity is. We never tried to understand the difference between security and scarcity. And in the definitions, we came up with the following. We found that availability, access, quality, quantity, and the reliable services. And the reliable services is what it defines water scarcity. We talked about possibility under integrated water resource management. We discussed about possibilities of providing different water qualities for different for different users, competing users. We talked about development of what we call water safety plans. In terms of supporting government, we talked of being able to share scientific information, information related to basic information you collect from communities. We talked about possible mapping And then finally, we talked about in instances where we do drilling of boreholes, we probably need to share what we call borehole drilling logs. This is information around the properties of the boreholes that we have drilled. I will also share those notes in time. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Luca. Ranjit?
Yeah, just to conclude water security point, we discussed a lot more detail and along with the examples. So what I just point a couple of statements. The one of the example we came through is the Vietnam and how they are managing and how they are using data and database decision making. So that was one of the very prominent example, and we try to replicate such examples in worldwide. Second, how they, in the absence of funding, how they are going for the integrated water source management. So we came out different tools and the funding that is available across the world. So we can use, let's say the example is the climate community-driven approaches, and we are going also to the climate resilient water plan, and how we are going to make it as a people movement rather than a policy-driven movement. So that is that's a concluding points from my side.
Fantastic, thanks Ranjit. And then our final topic on healthcare facilities, Alison.
Thanks, Fraser. We had a wonderfully rich discussion. We talked a little bit around the 8 practical steps that WHO and UNICEF have put forward that really, I guess, marry to some extent some of the WASH sector building blocks and the health system building blocks and align with the resolution on WASH in healthcare facilities. So we discussed progress towards each one of these blocks and where there has been progress made and where challenges remain. We felt as a group that it's still very much the WASH sector driving this agenda and still struggling with some health sector leadership. So it's not the health sector calling on us, but did acknowledge that COVID had changed that somewhat. And so from the WASH sector perspective, it had been really important around community engagement and engaging community WASH processes to also include the healthcare facility. But then likewise from a health sector perspective, really in driving progress against infection prevention and control and the need for WASH around that, but the challenges in mapping out roles and responsibilities among WASH sector actors in that, and also specialised infection prevention control people. We also touched on that this is just really a new topic. So while some of those challenges against the 8 practical steps were discussed, we just wanted to acknowledge that it's quite a new area, and some of that just might be the infancy of programs really driving progress against this issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. And last but not least, Roswell.
Yeah, thanks, Fraser. We also spent time talking about those 8 steps for WASH in healthcare facilities, and really comparing and contrasting our experience across different countries. In our group, we had some folks that were very far ahead in those 8 steps, and we had others that were just getting started. Some of the interesting things I noted was Boni in the Philippines was saying they're quite far ahead, although gathering data and research in general is a little bit of a challenge. Just kind of giving governmental priorities, whereas I was interested to hear that Tinley in Bhutan was saying a lot of the healthcare facilities are run by the government pretty strongly, and so they were seeing a lot of data there. Chena from WaterAid gave a really interesting overview of their work, working with the Cambodian government and doing things like working with the National Institutes of Public Health to ensure government ownership of data. And she brought up a good point about research around actual behaviors, and that a lot of the monitoring seemed to be focused on infrastructure more. And then and Chris mentioned that in Vanuatu it's hard to develop the workforce spread out between different islands, and then we did kind of get cut off there. But it was a great conversation, and thanks very much to everyone in healthcare facilities too for your inputs.
Fantastic, thanks everyone. So I apologize that we've run slightly over. I will briefly just share the last couple of slides. It would be great to have a few notes from each of the moderators, and we will combine the discussions from our session with the other 2 sessions that have happened yesterday for the other regions of the world, and we'll try and prepare a joint documentation that we can share with all of you. Here on the screen, you can see a few additional resources and links from each of our co-conveners of today's event. You can visit those links, and Alison will be dropping links in the chat box there for more information. So we hope that today has enabled you to connect with others in the sector and given you some new ideas and knowledge about how you can work to strengthen systems for sustainable and resilient wash and healthcare. Thank you very much for your participation and active discussion, and we hope you enjoy any other World Water Week at Home activities that you're participating in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fraser. Thank you, everyone. Have a very good day.
Thank you,
Stay
everyone.
safe.
Thank you, Fraser.
Thank you,
Safe and
everyone.
healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Safe.
everybody. I don't know if we can take a picture.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.